The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete walkway outside Fort Bradley's main commissary. Tuesday meant fresh deliveries, and the loading dock buzzed with activity as trucks backed up to unload supplies. Among the steady stream of people moving through the area, an old man walked slowly, his weathered hands gripping a simple wooden cane. Henry Morrison moved with the careful steps of someone whose body had seen better days. His thick gray hair was neatly combed, and despite his age, his back remained straight with military bearing. He wore a faded green jacket that had seen many years, and on his left shoulder, a small military patch caught the sunlight. 3 young cadets from the nearby academy rounded the corner, their polished boots clicking against the pavement in perfect rhythm. At 19 and 20 years old, they carried themselves with the confident swagger that came from months of basic training. Their uniforms were crisp, their brass buttons gleaming, and their faces wore the expression of young men who believed they knew everything about military life. Cadet First Class. Marcus Webb led the group, his chest puffed out with pride at his recent promotion. Behind him walked Cadet Riley Santos, a thin young man from California who never missed a chance to show off his knowledge of military history. The third member, Cadet James Fletcher, was the youngest of the group, but made up for it with the loudest voice and strongest opinions. They had just finished a particularly challenging training exercise and were heading to the commissary to grab lunch. Their instructor, Sergeant Martinez, had been especially hard on them that morning, and the young men were feeling the need to prove themselves to anyone who would listen. As they approached the commissary entrance, they noticed the old man ahead of them, moving slowly up the wheelchair ramp instead of taking the stairs. His careful, measured steps seemed to annoy Marcus, who was used to the quick pace of military life. "Look at this guy," Marcus muttered under his breath, loud enough for his friends to hear. "Taking forever just to get up a simple ramp." Riley snickered and adjusted his patrol cap. "Probably some old civilian who thinks he belongs on a military base. I bet he's never even served a day in his life." James, eager to join in, spoke even louder than his companions. "Yeah, look at that old jacket. Probably bought it at a thrift store to try and look military." What a joke. The 3 cadets picked up their pace, their voices carrying in the morning air. Other people in the area began to notice the commotion, some glancing disapprovingly at the young soldiers, but none willing to step in and correct their behavior. Henry Morrison heard every word. His weathered hands tightened slightly on his cane, but his expression remained calm and dignified. He had dealt with ignorance before, though it still stung when it came from young people wearing the same uniform he had once worn with pride. As the cadets drew closer, Marcus decided to make his commentary even more direct. "Excuse us, sir," he said in a voice dripping with false politeness. "Some of us actually have important military business to attend to. Maybe you could move a little faster?" The old man paused and turned slowly to face the 3 young soldiers. His eyes, though aged, were sharp and alert. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being heard. "I'm moving as quickly as I can, son. I hope you can understand." Riley stepped forward, emboldened by his friend's boldness. "We understand, all right. We understand that civilians shouldn't be clogging up military facilities. This commissary is for people who've actually earned the right to be here." Several other people in the area had stopped to watch the exchange. An elderly woman with a shopping cart shook her head disapprovingly at the cadets' behavior. A young soldier with sergeant's stripes looked like he wanted to intervene, but seemed unsure of the protocol when dealing with cadets from a different unit. Henry Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "I believe I have every right to be here, young man." James laughed harshly. "Oh, really? And what gives you that right? That fake jacket you're wearing? I bet you couldn't even tell us what unit that patch represents." The old man's hand moved unconsciously to the patch on his shoulder. his fingers brushing the fabric that had been sewn there many decades ago. The patch was faded and worn, its colors muted by years and weather, but it was authentic in every thread. "This patch," Henry said quietly, "represents a unit that served in places you've probably never heard of, doing things I hope you never have to do." Marcus rolled his eyes dramatically. "Right. Sure it does. Look, Grandpa, we're actual soldiers. We've been through real training. We know what real service looks like, and this isn't it." The crowd around them was growing larger, and the mood was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Several people looked like they wanted to say something to defend the old man, but military protocol and respect for the uniform made them hesitant to openly criticize the cadets. Henry Morrison took a deep breath and looked each of the three young men in the eye. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that came from decades of experience, though the cadets were too young and too full of themselves to recognize it. "I hope someday you'll understand that the uniform you're wearing comes with responsibilities. It's not just about authority or respect. It's about service to something bigger than yourself." Riley scoffed. "Don't lecture us about service, old man. We're the ones serving now. We're the ones who matter." "Yeah," James added, his voice getting louder and attracting even more attention. "You're just some old guy living in the past. The military doesn't need people like you anymore." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Henry Morrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. For just a moment, the careful, measured movements gave way to something else, a hint of the soldier he had once been. Marcus, feeling victorious, decided to push even further. "I bet you never even saw combat. Probably just some desk jockey who wants people to think he's a hero." "Real soldiers don't need to wear old patches to prove themselves." The accusation was like throwing gasoline on a fire that had been carefully controlled for years. Henry Morrison's eyes flashed, and for the first time in the conversation, his voice carried an edge that made several people in the crowd step back. "Son, you have no idea what you're talking about." But the cadets were too caught up in their own performance to notice the change in the old man's demeanor. They had an audience now, and they were determined to prove their superiority over this civilian who dared to wear military clothing on their base. James gestured dramatically at Henry's jacket. "Look at this thing. It's practically falling apart. No self-respecting soldier would be caught dead wearing something so pathetic." "Probably found it in his father's closet," Riley added with a sneer, "or bought it at a costume shop." Marcus nodded in agreement. "Either way, it's disrespectful to real military personnel. People like us who actually earned our uniforms through blood, sweat, and tears." The irony of three cadets with less than 2 years of training combined lecturing a veteran was lost on the young men, but it wasn't lost on the growing crowd of observers. Several military spouses exchanged knowing looks, while a few older veterans in civilian clothes watched with increasing discomfort. Henry Morrison straightened his shoulders, and despite his age and his cane, something in his bearing commanded attention. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but carried an authority that came from years of leading men in impossible situations. "Young man, I suggest you reconsider your words. You're making assumptions about things you don't understand." But Marcus was too far committed to back down now. The crowd was watching, and his pride wouldn't let him show any uncertainty in front of his fellow cadets. "I understand plenty," Marcus shot back. "I understand that this is a military base for military personnel. I understand that stolen valor is a serious offense. And I understand that old men who pretend to be soldiers dishonor everyone who actually served." The accusation of stolen valor rippled through the crowd like an electric shock. It was a serious charge, one that could destroy a man's reputation and even lead to legal consequences. Several people gasped audibly, while others began pulling out their phones, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Henry Morrison's face went pale, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of the accusation. His hand tightened on his cane until his knuckles showed white, and when he spoke, his voice carried a dangerous quiet that anyone with military experience would have recognized as a warning. "Son, I strongly advise you to stop talking right now." But James, feeding off the energy from his friends and the crowd, pressed the attack even further. "Or what? You'll report us to our commanding officer. Good luck with that. They'll want to see your credentials first, and something tells me you don't have any." Riley laughed and pulled out his phone. "Maybe we should call the MPs and have them escort this fake soldier off the base. I bet they'd love to make an example of someone committing stolen valor right here in broad daylight." The situation had escalated far beyond a simple disagreement. The accusation of stolen valor was now being made publicly, in front of dozens of witnesses, against a man whose only crime had been walking slowly to the commissary. Henry Morrison stood perfectly still for a long moment, his eyes moving from one young face to another. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that people had to strain to hear him, but every word carried the weight of absolute truth. "In my 62 years, I have never met 3 young men more in need of learning what respect actually means." Marcus laughed harshly. "Respect? You want respect? Then earn it." "Show us your military ID. Prove you have any right to wear that jacket. Until then, you're just another old man playing dress-up." The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, a mix of military personnel, retirees, and family members. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone seemed to sense that something important was happening, even if they couldn't yet understand what. Henry Morrison looked around at the faces surrounding him, some supportive, some uncertain, some openly hostile. He had faced hostile crowds before, in places much more dangerous than a commissary loading dock. But this felt different. These were Americans, people he had spent his life protecting, and they were watching 3 children in uniform humiliate an old man. When he spoke again, his voice carried a sadness that had nothing to do with the insults being thrown at him, and everything to do with what he saw happening to the military he had loved and served. "I hope someday you'll understand that the uniform you're wearing was paid for by people like me. People who gave years of their lives so that young men like you could stand here safely and make fools of yourselves." The words hit harder than any insult could have. There was something in the old man's tone, something in his bearing that made even the most skeptical observers begin to wonder if they were witnessing something terrible. But the cadets were too far committed to their course to back down now. Marcus stepped closer to the old man, close enough that his voice didn't need to carry to the crowd. "Listen, old man, we're not impressed by your act. We've heard every sob story and every fake war hero speech there is. You're not fooling anyone here." Henry Morrison met the young man's gaze directly, and for the first time in the entire confrontation, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile or a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had seen things that would break most people's minds and had somehow found a way to survive them. "Son," he said quietly, "I hope you never have to find out just how wrong you are." The crowd fell silent. Something in the old man's tone, something in his eyes, had shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Even the cadets seemed to sense that they might have pushed too far, but their pride wouldn't let them back down. And that's when the sound of approaching footsteps caught everyone's attention. Heavy, purposeful steps that carried the unmistakable rhythm of a senior military officer approaching at a brisk pace. The crowd began to part, creating a clear path toward the confrontation that had been building for the past 15 minutes. Someone very important was coming, and everyone present knew that the situation was about to change dramatically. General Patricia Hawthorne moved through the crowd with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. At 54 years old, she carried herself with the bearing that came from 3 decades of military service, including 2 combat deployments and command of one of the Army's most prestigious divisions. Her Silver Eagle insignia caught the morning sunlight as she approached the commotion that had brought normal base operations to a standstill. She had been heading to a routine meeting with base logistics when her aide, Captain Rodriguez, had received word that a disturbance was developing near the commissary. Initial reports suggested cadets were involved, which immediately caught her attention. As the senior officer responsible for the training command that oversaw several military academies in the region, any incident involving cadets fell under her purview. What she hadn't expected to find was 3 young soldiers publicly humiliating an elderly man in front of dozens of witnesses. The crowd parted respectfully as she approached, many recognizing her rank and stepping aside with the automatic deference that senior officers commanded. Captain Rodriguez followed close behind, his notebook ready and his expression growing more concerned as he observed the scene. As the general's aide, he had seen her handle difficult situations before, but the tension in the air suggested this was something beyond a typical disciplinary issue. The 3 cadets were still focused on their confrontation with the old man, their voices carrying clearly across the area. General Hawthorne stopped at the edge of the crowd, close enough to hear every word, but far enough back to observe the situation fully before intervening. "Maybe we should call security and have them remove this fake soldier from the base," James was saying, his voice loud and confident. "I bet he doesn't even have proper identification." Marcus nodded in agreement. "Stolen valor is a federal offense. We'd be doing our patriotic duty by reporting him." Riley pulled out his phone and started recording. "This'll make great evidence when we file the report. Look at this guy, everyone. This is what dishonoring the uniform looks like." General Hawthorne's jaw tightened as she watched the scene unfold. In her 30 years of service, she had encountered plenty of young soldiers who needed attitude adjustments, but the level of disrespect she was witnessing went beyond typical cadet arrogance. These young men were publicly accusing an elderly civilian of a federal crime based on nothing more than his age and appearance. The old man, for his part, stood with remarkable dignity despite the assault on his character. His posture remained straight, his expression calm, and his voice measured when he spoke. But General Hawthorne noticed something else, something in his bearing that spoke of years of military experience, something the cadets were too inexperienced to recognize. "Young man," the old man said to Riley, "I suggest you put that phone away and reconsider what you're doing." Marcus stepped forward aggressively. "Or what? You'll call your lawyer? You'll sue us? Go ahead and try. We're protected by the truth, old man, and the truth is you're a fraud." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. General Hawthorne had heard enough. She began moving forward, her presence immediately noticed by those around her. Conversations stopped, people stepped aside, and the automatic respect accorded to a general officer began to change the entire dynamic of the scene. Captain Rodriguez announced her approach in the traditional manner. "General officer on deck." The effect was immediate and electric. Every military person in the crowd snapped to attention, their backs straight and their eyes forward. The 3 cadets, caught in the middle of their harassment, suddenly found themselves surrounded by dozens of people standing at attention for a superior officer. Marcus, Riley, and James spun around, their eyes widening as they saw the silver eagles on General Hawthorne's collar. Their aggressive postures collapsed into hasty attempts at military bearing, but their faces showed the unmistakable expression of soldiers who knew they had been caught doing something wrong. "At ease," General Hawthorne commanded, her voice carrying across the area with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The crowd relaxed slightly, but the tension remained thick. She approached the 3 cadets directly, her eyes taking in their appearance, their uniforms, and their name tags. Her expression remained neutral, but anyone with experience reading senior officers would have recognized the dangerous calm that preceded a major storm. "Cadets Webb, Santos, and Fletcher," she said, her voice level but carrying an edge that made all three young men straighten involuntarily. "I am General Hawthorne, commanding officer of the Regional Training Command. Would one of you care to explain what's happening here?" Marcus, as the senior cadet, stepped forward and attempted a confident explanation. "Ma'am, we encountered this civilian wearing what appears to be unauthorized military clothing. When we questioned his right to be on base, he became confrontational and claimed to be a veteran, but we have reason to believe he's committing stolen valor." General Hawthorne's eyes moved to the elderly man, taking in his appearance more carefully. What she saw made her heart rate increase slightly. The man's bearing, despite his age, carried the unmistakable mark of someone with extensive military experience. His posture, even leaning on a cane, maintained the straight-backed stance of a lifelong soldier. But it was the patch on his jacket that caught her attention and made her breath catch in her throat. The patch was faded and worn, its colors muted by decades of wear, but General Hawthorne recognized it immediately. It was the unit patch of the 5th Special Forces Group, specifically the variant worn during operations in Southeast Asia during the late 1960s and early 1970s. She had seen similar patches in military museums and in the collections of Vietnam veterans, but never one that looked so authentically aged and worn. "Sir," she said, addressing the elderly man directly, "might I ask your name?" Henry Morrison straightened as much as his aged frame would allow. When he spoke, his voice carried the automatic respect that one military person shows another, regardless of current status. "Henry Morrison, ma'am. And before you ask, yes, I have every right to be here." General Hawthorne nodded slowly, her eyes moving between the old man and the three cadets who had been harassing him. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, and what she was seeing made her increasingly concerned about what had transpired. "Mr. Morrison," she continued, "these cadets have accused you of stolen valor. That's a very serious charge. Do you have any response to that accusation?" Henry Morrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. "General, I've been accused of many things in my life, but dishonoring the uniform has never been one of them." Riley, emboldened by the general's presence and still convinced he was in the right, stepped forward. "Ma'am, with respect, this man has been claiming to be a veteran, but look at him. He's obviously too old to have served in any recent conflicts, and that jacket looks like something from a costume store." General Hawthorne's attention turned to the young cadet, and her expression grew noticeably colder. "Cadet Santos, are you suggesting that age disqualifies someone from having served their country? Are you implying that only recent conflicts count as legitimate military service?" The question hung in the air like a trap that Riley suddenly realized he might have walked into. "Ma'am, no. I just meant—" "What did you mean, cadet?" General Hawthorne's voice cut through his attempt at explanation like a blade. "Please be very specific about what you meant." James, sensing that his friend was in trouble but not understanding why, attempted to support him. "General, ma'am, what we meant was that this man's claims don't add up. He says he's a veteran, but he can't prove it. And that patch he's wearing looks fake." General Hawthorne's eyes moved to the patch again, and this time she stepped closer to examine it more carefully. What she saw made her stomach tighten with growing realization. The patch wasn't just authentic, it was combat-worn. The fading wasn't from age alone, it was from exposure to the elements in harsh conditions. The stitching showed the wear patterns that came from years of field use, and the fabric had the particular texture that developed only after extended time in tropical climates. "Cadet Fletcher," she said without looking away from the patch, "you say this patch looks fake. Tell me, what do you know about the unit this patch represents? James shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that he was being tested on knowledge he didn't possess. Ma'am, I'm not sure of the specific unit, but you felt qualified to judge its authenticity, General Hawthorne finished for him. Interesting approach to military intelligence. Cadet. Marcus, recognizing that the conversation was not going in their favor, attempted to regain control of the situation. General, ma'am, regardless of the specific unit, the fact remains that this man has no proper identification and is disrupting base operations. We were simply trying to maintain security. General Hawthorne turned her full attention to Marcus, and her expression made several people in the crowd take an involuntary step backward. Cadet Webb, you say Mr. Morrison was disrupting base operations. Please describe these disruptions. Marcus suddenly realized that he was being asked to justify their actions in front of a general officer, with dozens of witnesses present. Ma'am, he was moving slowly and blocking access to the commissary entrance. He was walking up the wheelchair ramp because he uses a cane, General Hawthorne stated flatly. Are you suggesting that disabled individuals should not use accessibility features designed for their use? The question exposed the fundamental cruelty of what the cadets had been doing. They had been harassing an elderly, disabled man for using the facilities designed to help him navigate the world with dignity. Riley, still not understanding the gravity of their situation, attempted to defend their actions. Ma'am, we were just concerned about base security. We have a duty to report suspicious activity. General Hawthorne's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. Cadet Santos, tell me exactly what suspicious activity you observed. Be specific. Riley looked around desperately, suddenly realizing that everything they had done could be easily challenged. Ma'am, he was wearing military clothing without proper authorization. Have you seen his authorization, Cadet? Did you ask to see his military ID before making accusations? No, ma'am, but you assumed, General Hawthorne cut him off. You assumed that an elderly man with a cane couldn't possibly be a legitimate veteran. You assumed that his age and apparent disability meant he had no right to wear a military jacket. You assumed that your limited experience gave you the authority to judge another person's service record. The three cadets were beginning to understand that they were in serious trouble, but they still didn't comprehend the full magnitude of their mistake. They saw only an elderly civilian who had somehow gained the attention and apparent support of a general officer. General Hawthorne turned back to Henry Morrison, and her voice took on a tone of professional respect. Mr. Morrison, I apologize for what you've experienced here today. Would you be willing to provide some details about your service history? Henry Morrison nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. I served with the 5th Special Forces Group from 1968 to 1975. 2 tours in Vietnam, 1 in Cambodia for operations that officially never happened. After that, I was attached to various special operations units until my retirement in 1995. The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Vietnam veteran, Special Forces, operations in Cambodia that officially never happened. The implications were staggering, and General Hawthorne's expression showed that she understood exactly what she was hearing. Captain Rodriguez, who had been taking notes throughout the confrontation, stopped writing and stared at Henry Morrison with new understanding. As a military history enthusiast, he knew enough about special operations in Southeast Asia to realize that they were in the presence of someone who had participated in some of the most dangerous and classified missions of the Vietnam era. But the 3 cadets still didn't understand. Marcus, confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere, pressed forward with his accusations. General, ma'am, anyone can claim to have served in Vietnam. Without proper documentation, these are just stories. General Hawthorne turned to face Marcus with an expression that made seasoned sergeants step backward. Cadet Webb, are you questioning my ability to verify military service records? Are you suggesting that I would take such claims at face value without proper investigation? Marcus realized too late that he had just questioned a general officer's competence in front of dozens of witnesses. "Ma'am, no, I didn't mean—" "What did you mean, cadet?" Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly across the silent crowd. "Please explain to everyone here exactly what you meant." The crowd had grown to nearly 100 people now, as word of the confrontation had spread throughout the base. Military personnel, retirees, family members, and civilian employees had all gathered to witness what was clearly becoming a major incident. Henry Morrison watched the exchange with the patient expression of someone who had seen young soldiers make mistakes before and knew that the learning process could be painful. When he spoke, his voice carried a gentleness that seemed out of place, given how he had been treated. "General, if I may, these young men are just doing what they think is right. They're trying to protect the honor of the uniform, even if they're going about it the wrong way." His attempt at mercy only seemed to make General Hawthorne's expression grow more severe. "Mr. Morrison, that's very generous of you, but harassment and false accusations are not acceptable methods of protecting anything." She turned back to the three cadets, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Cadets Webb, Santos, and Fletcher, you have publicly accused a military veteran of federal crimes based on nothing more than his age and appearance. You have harassed an elderly, disabled man who was simply trying to go about his business. You have demonstrated a complete lack of respect, judgment, and basic human decency." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Around the crowd, people began to understand that they were witnessing something more than a simple disciplinary action. This was about fundamental values, about what it meant to wear the uniform, and about the respect owed to those who had served before. James, finally beginning to grasp the seriousness of their situation, attempted a final defense. "Ma'am, we were just trying to uphold military standards." General Hawthorne's response was immediate and devastating. "Cadet Fletcher, harassing elderly veterans is not a military standard. Assuming civilians are criminals based on their appearance is not a military standard. Making public accusations without evidence is not a military standard. What you have demonstrated today is the complete opposite of every value the military stands for." The crowd was completely silent now, everyone understanding that they were witnessing a defining moment. The three cadets stood frozen, finally beginning to comprehend that their actions had consequences far beyond what they had imagined. And then General Hawthorne did something that changed everything. She stepped closer to Henry Morrison and examined his patch with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "that patch you're wearing, it's not just any fifth group patch, is it?" Henry Morrison's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, it's just a unit patch." But General Hawthorne was studying it more carefully now, her eyes focusing on details that others couldn't see. And what she discovered made her face go pale with sudden understanding. General Hawthorne's hands trembled slightly as she examined the patch more closely. What had caught her attention wasn't just the unit designation of the 5th Special Forces Group, but the specific variant and the additional markings that were barely visible to the untrained eye. This wasn't just any Vietnam-era patch. This was something far more significant. Embroidered beneath the main unit insignia, so faded that it was almost invisible, were symbols that only someone with extensive knowledge of special operations history would recognize. A small skull and crossed arrows, barely discernible after decades of wear, marked this as the patch of someone who had served with the Studies and Observations Group, SOG. General Hawthorne's breath caught in her throat. SOG had been one of the most classified and dangerous special operations units in military history. Operating primarily in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia during the height of the war, SOG personnel had conducted reconnaissance, direct action, and psychological operations behind enemy lines, often with casualty rates that exceeded 50%. "Dear God," she whispered, so quietly that only Henry Morrison could hear her. "You were SOG." Henry Morrison's eyes met hers, and in that moment, she saw the confirmation she both hoped for and dreaded. The quiet dignity, the unshakable calm under pressure, the way he carried himself despite his age. It all made perfect sense now. She wasn't looking at just any Vietnam veteran. She was looking at a member of one of the most elite and dangerous units in American military history. The three cadets, still oblivious to what was happening, watched the exchange with growing confusion. Marcus, still convinced that they were in the right, stepped forward again. "General, ma'am, I don't understand why we're spending so much time on this. The man still hasn't shown proper identification, and—" "Cadet Webb." General Hawthorne's voice cut through his words like a blade, but now it carried something beyond anger. It carried awe, respect, and a dawning horror at what had transpired. "I strongly suggest you stop talking immediately." But Marcus, his pride wounded and his judgment clouded, couldn't let it go. "Ma'am, with respect, stolen valor is a serious crime. Just because this man tells stories about Vietnam doesn't mean—" "Attention!" General Hawthorne's command voice exploded across the area with such force that every person in the crowd snapped to rigid attention automatically. The power and authority in her voice was something that none of the cadets had ever experienced before. In the sudden silence that followed, she turned to face Henry Morrison directly. When she spoke, her voice carried a reverence that made everyone present understand that something fundamental had changed in the situation. "Sir," she said, and the single word carried more respect than the cadets had shown in their entire careers. "Would you be Sergeant Major Henry Morrison, formerly of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group?" Henry Morrison's expression shifted, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked like the veteran he truly was. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had led men through impossible situations and brought them home alive. "Yes, ma'am. Sergeant Major Morrison, retired." The words hit the assembled crowd like a thunderclap. Sergeant Major, the highest enlisted rank in the Army, a man who had reached the pinnacle of the enlisted ranks, someone who had served for decades and earned the respect of every officer he had ever worked with. Captain Rodriguez dropped his pen entirely, his mouth opening in shock. As a student of military history, he knew enough about SOG to understand exactly what they were dealing with. SOG personnel were legends, the subject of books and documentaries, men who had conducted operations so classified that many of their missions were still secret 50 years later. General Hawthorne took a step back and, in front of the entire crowd, rendered a perfect salute to Henry Morrison. The gesture was unprecedented, a general officer saluting a retired enlisted man in public, but everyone present understood that this was about something far beyond traditional military protocol. "Sergeant Major Morrison," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd, "on behalf of the United States Army and everyone present, I apologize for the disgraceful treatment you have received here today." The three cadets stood frozen in shock, finally beginning to understand that they had made a catastrophic mistake. They had accused a decorated war veteran, a sergeant major with nearly 3 decades of service, of stolen valor. They had publicly humiliated a member of one of the most elite units in military history. Riley's face had gone completely white. "Ma'am, we didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask." General Hawthorne cut him off without turning away from Sergeant Major Morrison. "You made assumptions based on ignorance and arrogance." James, his voice barely a whisper, attempted an apology. "Sergeant Major, sir, we're sorry. We made a mistake." "You made more than a mistake. General Hawthorne said, finally turning to face the three cadets. You committed an act of such profound disrespect that it dishonors everything this uniform represents. Sergeant Major Morrison raised his hand slightly, his voice calm and measured. General, if I may, these young men were trying to do what they thought was right. They're still learning. His attempt at mercy only seemed to make the situation worse for the cadets. Here was a man they had accused of federal crimes, and he was trying to defend them to a general officer who looked ready to end their military careers on the spot. General Hawthorne's expression showed no softening. Sergeant Major, your generosity of spirit is noted and appreciated, but what happened here today cannot be dismissed as a learning experience. She turned to face the three cadets directly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute judgment. Cadets, Webb, Santos, and Fletcher, you have publicly accused a decorated war hero of federal crimes. You have harassed a disabled veteran who was simply trying to go about his daily business. You have demonstrated ignorance, arrogance, and a complete lack of the basic respect that should define every member of the military. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 200 people now, as word of the confrontation had spread throughout the base. Military personnel of all ranks, retirees, family members, and civilian employees had gathered to witness what had become a defining moment about military values and respect for veterans. Marcus, desperate to salvage something from the situation, made one final attempt to justify their actions. Ma'am, how were we supposed to know? He looks like just another old man. Stop! General Hawthorne's command cut through his words with finality. Cadet Webb, every word you speak makes this worse. You are suggesting that elderly Americans deserve harassment unless they can prove their worth to your satisfaction. She stepped closer to the three cadets, her voice dropping to a level that somehow carried more menace than any shout could have. Let me explain something to you about the man you've been humiliating for the past 30 minutes. The crowd leaned forward, sensing that they were about to hear something significant. Sergeant Major Morrison served 8 tours in Southeast Asia. 8 tours. He participated in classified operations that helped save thousands of American lives. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, 3 Silver Stars, and 5 Purple Hearts. He was wounded 7 times in service to his country, and the injuries he sustained are the reason he needs that cane you mocked. Each fact hit the crowd like a physical blow. The Distinguished Service Cross was second only to the Medal of Honor. 3 Silver Stars meant repeated acts of extraordinary heroism. 5 Purple Hearts meant he had been wounded in combat 5 separate times and had chosen to return to duty each time. But General Hawthorne wasn't finished. After his combat service, Sergeant Major Morrison spent 15 years training special operations personnel, young soldiers like yourselves. He taught them how to survive, how to complete impossible missions, and how to honor the uniform they wore. Hundreds of soldiers are alive today because of what he taught them. The 3 cadets stood in stunned silence, finally understanding the magnitude of their mistake. They had accused one of the most decorated veterans on the base of being a fraud. They had mocked his disabilities, which had been earned in service to his country. They had publicly humiliated a man who had devoted his entire adult life to military service. Riley began to cry, the full weight of what they had done finally sinking in. Sergeant Major, sir, we're so sorry. We didn't know. We didn't understand. You didn't understand because you didn't try to understand, General Hawthorne said coldly. You saw an elderly man with a cane and decided he was worthless. You saw authentic military decorations and assumed they were fake. You saw a quiet dignity and mistook it for weakness. James fell to his knees, overwhelmed by shame and the realization that their military careers were likely over before they had truly begun. Sir, please, we'll do anything to make this right. Sergeant Major Morrison looked down at the young soldier kneeling before him. and his expression showed the complex mix of disappointment and understanding that came from decades of dealing with young soldiers who had made serious mistakes. "Son," he said quietly, "the only way to make this right is to learn from it, to understand that the uniform you wear was paid for by people like me and the thousands of others who served before you, to remember that respect isn't something you give only to people who look important to you." General Hawthorne nodded in agreement, then addressed the entire crowd. "Let this be a lesson to everyone present. The man standing before you represents the very best of military service. He exemplifies the values of honor, courage, and dedication that we all swore to uphold when we put on this uniform." She turned back to the 3 cadets, her voice carrying final judgment. "Cadets Webb, Santos, and Fletcher, you will report to my office at 800 tomorrow morning. Your conduct today will be thoroughly reviewed and appropriate disciplinary action will be taken. Your behavior has brought dishonor to your academy, to your uniforms, and to yourselves." Marcus, his voice breaking, made one final plea. "General, ma'am, please. We understand now. We'll never make this mistake again." "Cadet Webb," General Hawthorne replied coldly, "your understanding comes too late and at too high a cost. The damage you've done today extends far beyond your own careers. You've demonstrated to this entire community that some young soldiers lack the basic character necessary to wear the uniform." The crowd began to stir as the confrontation reached its conclusion, but General Hawthorne raised her hand for silence. She had one final lesson to deliver, and she wanted everyone present to hear it clearly. "Sergeant Major Morrison has shown more grace and dignity in the past 30 minutes than these 3 cadets have shown in their entire military careers. He has demonstrated what it truly means to be a soldier, even in retirement, even when facing undeserved hostility." She turned to Sergeant Major Morrison one final time and rendered another perfect salute. "Sergeant Major, it has been an honor to meet you. Your service to our country will never be forgotten, and you have my personal guarantee that what happened here today will not happen again." Sergeant Major Morrison returned the salute with the practiced precision of someone who had rendered and received thousands of salutes throughout his career. "Thank you, General. And please remember, these young men made a mistake, but they're still soldiers. They still have the potential to learn and grow." His final act of mercy for the cadets who had humiliated him left many in the crowd in tears. Here was a man who had every right to be angry, every justification for demanding punishment, and he was using his moment of vindication to ask for leniency for those who had wronged him. General Hawthorne nodded solemnly. "Your recommendation will be noted in their files, Sergeant Major, but their actions today have consequences that cannot be avoided." As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Sergeant Major Morrison to shake his hand, to thank him for his service, and to apologize for what he had endured. Military personnel of all ranks rendered respectful salutes, while retirees and family members offered words of gratitude and support. The 3 cadets stood alone in the center of the area, isolated by their actions and facing an uncertain future. They watched as person after person approached the man they had accused of being a fraud, each interaction driving home the magnitude of their mistake. Captain Rodriguez approached General Hawthorne with his notebook filled with details of the incident. "Ma'am, I've documented everything that occurred. The entire confrontation was witnessed by nearly 200 people." "Good," General Hawthorne replied. "This incident will be thoroughly investigated and all witnesses will be interviewed. What happened here today represents a failure of leadership, training, and basic character that cannot be ignored." As the formal crowd dispersed, a small group of veterans gathered around Sergeant Major Morrison, sharing stories and expressing their respect for his service. Among them was an elderly man who recognized him from their shared service decades earlier, and a young soldier who thanked him for the training that had saved his life during a recent deployment. The 3 cadets finally approached Sergeant Major Morrison as the crowd thinned, their faces showing the full weight of shame and regret. Marcus spoke for the group, his voice barely audible. "Sergeant Major, sir, we know we can't undo what we did today. We know we don't deserve your forgiveness. But we want you to know that we will spend the rest of our careers trying to become the kind of soldiers you are." Sergeant Major Morrison looked at each of them carefully, his eyes searching their faces for signs of genuine remorse and understanding. When he spoke, his voice carried the wisdom of someone who had spent decades developing young soldiers. "Sons, the military is about second chances, but only for those who truly learn from their mistakes. What you did today was wrong, and it will have consequences. But if you can learn from this, if you can grow into better soldiers and better men, then some good may come from this terrible day." Riley wiped tears from his eyes as he spoke. "Sir, how do we become better? How do we make sure we never make this kind of mistake again?" "By remembering this moment," Sergeant Major Morrison replied. "By remembering how it feels to realize you've wronged someone who didn't deserve it. By remembering that respect is something you give freely, not something you withhold until someone proves their worth to you." James nodded, his face showing the seriousness of someone who had learned a life-changing lesson. "Sir, we'll remember. We promise we'll remember." "See that you do," Sergeant Major Morrison said quietly. "Because the uniform you wear was purchased with the blood and sacrifice of men and women who face things you can't imagine. Honor them. Honor it." As the last of the crowd dispersed and normal base operations resumed, Sergeant Major Morrison made his way slowly up the ramp to the commissary, his original destination before the confrontation began. His dignity remained intact, his bearing still proud despite the ordeal he had endured. The three cadets watched him go, each carrying the weight of a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had learned that assumptions could be dangerous, that respect was not optional, and that the quiet dignity of a true veteran was worth more than all the bluster and arrogance they could muster. General Hawthorne remained in the area for several more minutes, speaking with witnesses and ensuring that all aspects of the incident were properly documented. As she finally prepared to leave, she took one last look at the spot where the confrontation had taken place. In her 30 years of military service, she had seen many examples of courage, honor, and dedication. But she had rarely seen such a clear demonstration of the difference between genuine military bearing and empty posturing. Sergeant Major Morrison had shown what it truly meant to be a soldier, while 3 young cadets had shown what happened when military training was not accompanied by character and wisdom. The incident would become a case study at the academy, a powerful lesson about respect, assumptions, and the true meaning of military service. And somewhere in the files of military history, the story would be preserved as a reminder that the uniform alone does not make a soldier. It is character, honor, and respect for others that truly define military service. The morning sun continued to shine down on Fort Bradley, but for everyone who had witnessed the confrontation, the day had been forever changed by a lesson in respect, humility, and the true cost of military service.